Good day and welcome to you wherever in the world you may be watching or listening to this. My name is Gordon Harris from the Gowling WLG International Leadership Team. Welcome to the latest in this series of conversations with leading figures in the IP world. My guest today, Andrea Brewster, has had an illustrious career as a patent attorney for many years, rising to become president of the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys in the UK in 2015. But around the same time, she was instrumental in founding an organization called IP Inclusive, with the goal of improving diversity and accessibility in the IP profession. She is now the lead executive officer of IP Inclusive. So welcome, Andrea. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start at the beginning, shall we? You studied natural sciences, a STEM degree at university. How did that come about? At the time you were doing that, maybe not so many women were taking science degrees.
That's right, actually. Yeah, I got to making A-level choices, and I was torn really between languages and science. But I figured, both my parents were language teachers, and I figured languages I could probably acquire outside of school, whereas science was going to require proper training. And also there's an element, isn't there, in any teenager, you've got to do something different to what your parents did.
Oh yeah.
So I took up maths, chemistry and physics at A-level. There were very few girls, particularly in the physics group, but we had some great teachers, and a particularly encouraging chemistry teacher who persuaded me to go on and do major on chemistry at university.
Right.
And thanks to him, I no thanks to my own ambition, which was pretty low, I did end up at Cambridge. And Gordon, you know, that's sort of a mixed blessing for me. I have mixed feelings about it, but I had a great time at Cambridge, and I got a good degree, and I was lucky that I found a college where there were lots of people like me, so state school educated, parents not very well off, on full grant. So, you know, I felt really comfortable there and had a great time. But I've seen afterwards how that Cambridge label has sort of opened doors automatically, perhaps, and doors that I haven't really had to press too hard against. I haven't had to fight to prove myself. It's just been assumed that that is good enough. So, yeah, I have mixed feelings about what Cambridge did for me in my career, and that's partly why social mobility is something I'm particularly keen on.
We will come back to that later. What happened to the languages, incidentally? Did you pick them up?
Well, I sort of kept them on for quite a while, and I can still muddle by in French and German. And of course, that helped a lot because at the time, becoming what was then known as a patent agent required language skills, still does to an extent for the European patents. So, you know, that it was still a good fit.
Well, maybe that handy blend sort of answers my next question, really, which is how did you make the jump then from having studied science at university into the world of IP?
Yeah, jump is a good word. It was it was a leap of faith, really. So there I am in my final year at uni. Absolutely no idea what I'm going to do, except that well, there are two things I know that I'm definitely not going to do. One of them is chartered accountancy. Because this is late 1980s, right? So all the STEM graduates are being picked out by the Ernst & Youngs of this world, and chartered accountancy is the new sexy career if you're a scientist, presumably because you're numerate. And that wasn't really.
That's not a word that often gets. It's not a word that often gets used in conjunction with accountancy, is it? But you know, there we are. I'll take it for today. Right,
perhaps they were looking for the wrong skill set. Anyway, that wasn't for me. I knew that. But I also knew that I wasn't destined to carry on in academia or do any kind of research, because I loved the chemistry. But when you put me in the lab, it didn't matter how closely I followed the instructions, everything I made turned into a sort of brown gunk in the bottom of a flask. And, you know, there would be helpful comments about now go and take a melting point from the fine white crystals you've produced. And I used to have to go around the lab and borrow somebody else's fine white crystals to take a melting point, or perhaps even better, just borrow somebody else's melting point. So it was clear that I was not going to end up there.
Right.
So I did what you're supposed to do and went to see a careers advisor, and I got lucky there. There was someone who knew his stuff, and he looked at my skill set, the languages, the communication and the science. and said, have you thought of becoming a patent agent, which is what patent attorneys were called then. And I said, what's a patent agent? Closely followed by, actually, what's a patent? Because you could go through 3 years of a science degree and not be told anything about patents. So it was I mean, I think that still happens in some cases now. So it was a shot in the dark, but I gave it a try, and it just worked really well. I mean, it was the dream career for me, because you're kind of interpreting between different worlds, the science, the business, the law. You are an interpreter, so that the language bit comes in. So I was given this little sort of tatty leaflet with a few names and addresses of patent agent firms. And I wrote off a few speculative applications and got a couple of interviews. The first interviewer asked me if I liked crosswords. I said, no. He said, well, that's a shame, because in his vast experience, people who were good at patent agency were good at crosswords. So that was the end of that. My second, it was incredible, isn't it? My second interviewer asked if I liked pasta, because there was a nice Italian down the road. So we went for lunch.
That's better.
Yeah.
That's better.
People didn't know much about interviewing in those days, but it worked out well. You know, I got on really well with Mike Harrison. I joined him at Cock Dykes and Lord down in London, and the rest is history, really.
Indeed, yeah. Well, you worked obviously in well-known, reputed patent attorney firm for a number of years, but then in around 2000, you took what is an even bigger step, really, and even you will use the word jump again, of getting involved with a startup firm, and you ended up giving your name to it. I mean, what prompted that move for you?
Well, you'll see, Gordon, there's a bit of a pattern emerging here, that most of my career is just sort of lucky happenstance. So Carol Greaves was someone that I worked with at Newbin Ellis. She moved on and set up her own practice. And she got back in touch at a certain point and said, look, I've got too much work for one person now. Would you like to come and join me? It was not something I'd been planning to do at all. It was obviously risky compared to a salaried job. But I just thought, you know, this feels right. I rated Carol very highly. It could be very exciting. It could acquire me new skills, and it could give me the flexibility I needed, because I'd got a young family at the time. So I said yes, and I remember Carol and her husband sort of coming around for dinner one night and bringing with them a sort of box of provisions for their first employee. So, you know, sort of printer paper and staplers and floppy disks. Remember those?
Oh, yes, I do.
So I have my supply of floppy disks, and I was ready to start up. And it proved to be a really good decision to make. This was in the autumn of 1999 that I joined forces with Carol. And later the following year, we actually went into partnership and formed Andrea Brewster. But at the time, I was just an employee to see how it went. And mid-December 1999, everybody getting ready for Christmas, my husband got killed in a car crash. So, you know, suddenly the whole world falls apart. I've got 3 children under 5, one of them actually only 5 months old. And there I am. But Carol was there. Carol was there for me the whole way through. And I'd got myself a job through her that gave me the flexibility I needed to carry on working despite being a single parent, despite having all of that to deal with. And Carol supported me. And in many ways, having the work kept me going. You know, you need something outside of children in that kind of situation. So, yeah, it turned into a very lucky break.
And obviously, as you said, that presumably you needed additional flexibility as well, which that arrangement was able to give you an unimaginable time. I mean, really shocking. So obviously, Carol herself sadly passed away last year. You've moved on to other things, but the firm remains. So, you know, how would you sum up her contribution and legacy to that firm and its values?
Carol just underpinned it. I mean, Carol was incredibly good at getting down to the things that really mattered, both in the job and in life generally. And it made her one of the best patent attorneys I've ever come across, because she could get straight through all the detail, all the technical waffle, and home in on the few issues that were really important. And she could home in on what was important for the client too. So she could do a job that was never over-engineered. It was generally very quick and efficient, cost effective, because she could get through to the issues that really mattered to them as a business. But she was like that, you know, everything about her own business was the same. So she knew it didn't matter about having posh city centre offices. You know, she started out working in her garage. I started out in my neighbour's garage. We graduated to a couple of rooms above the video shop in the village. Some of our listeners probably don't even know what a video shop is, but you know, we had the rooms above it. So she knew that didn't matter, but she knew what did matter was that the people working in those 2 rooms above the video shop did a very professional job, as good as anything you'd have got out of a city centre lawyer. And she knew that it didn't matter that we had difficult or complex policies and procedures. So you know, our first members agreement was 1.5 sides long, and cash flow was worked out with back of fag packet calculations and things. So she knew that didn't matter, but what did matter was that the systems we had to support the fee earners were robust and sensible. So we had incredibly good systems for monitoring deadlines and filing and you know, things that a patent attorney needs. We didn't skimp on those things. Carol got those right. And she also knew it was important that the people delivering the service were happy and looked after. And this is the really important thing, which, you know, has stayed with Greaves Brewster ever since, and with me, is that they were all equal. So that the person that put away your filing or emptied your bins was every bit as important as the fee earner that generated the invoices. And that continues to guide Greaves Brewster and the current team that are running it. And that, I think, is Carol's legacy, the importance of the things that really matter.
Yeah, it's when you get great values in an institution, they do underpin it, don't they, and secure the future of it. And you need someone to lay that foundation. Well, it sounds like the 2 of you did that together, which is terrific. And also, you talked earlier about her commerciality, and you know, this is one of the key things about patents, isn't it? They're not a vanity project; they're a business asset, and you have to keep that in mind as well, don't you, at all times?
You do. I mean, there's a tendency to think of patents in terms of law and technology. Understanding those is really only half the story. The other half is knowing how they're going to be used as commercial tools. And a client can't always afford to pay you to do a spanking legal or technical job and go into all the details. They just want answers.
Yeah. So after a number of years of service on the Council of the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys, you became president in 2015, which is, you know, pinnacle of the profession in many ways. What was the most challenging thing about that role, and what would you say was your proudest achievement of your presidential year?
Challenges. So let's talk about imposter syndrome, shall we? in fact, let's talk about mental health as well while we're at it. So for a lot of my life, I've struggled with ups and downs, and when I'm in an up, I think I can probably conquer the world, and when I'm in a down, it's acute anxiety and depression, and a lot of this, what has now been labelled as imposter syndrome, you know, feeling I'm not good enough, I'm not doing the job as well as other people would, I don't deserve to be there, and sooner or later, despite everything, someone's going to find me out. Now, when you get into a leadership position, any leadership position, there are bound to be people who criticise you, or disagree with you, disapprove of you. And of course, patent attorneys are not renowned for their tact. So, you know, there were some nasty comments made, and the people who are close to me know that some tears were shed. You know, I did have some difficult moments. What didn't help, I think, was I was a rather unconventional president in a lot of respects. I was younger than most. I wasn't in London. I wasn't from one of the old established firms. I wasn't male, which was a bit of a downer, but, you know, you can get over that. I didn't understand the Latin they used in their meeting minutes. And anyway, I wanted the meeting minutes to be shorter. So I had a kind of a bulldozing approach to getting down to the stuff that really mattered. And oh yeah, I used to publish a not so secret diary, which was a rather irreverent blog take on my time as a SEPA council member, and that didn't go down well with some people. You know, it was hugely popular, but some people thought it was undignified. So I was up against all of this, and I didn't have a difficult presidency in the sense that there were no big challenges like Brexit or COVID-19. But I think I did have to fight harder than many because I didn't fit the usual mould. So those are the challenges, and combine that with the fact that I was having to do quite a lot of travelling because I'm based in Somerset. And I'm a natural introvert. I can do the big groups of people, but it tires me out. I need time to myself to recharge. And of course, presidential duties can be quite draining in that respect. So when you say what's your proudest achievement, it's possibly just, you know, hanging in there for a whole year.
Getting through it. Yeah.
There was more to it than that. I genuinely feel that during my presidency, I did build some relationships and bridges for SEPA where previously there might have been boundaries. I think historically the Institute had been a little bit standoffish, a little bit defensive. We became much better at collaborating with other IP sector organisations and sharing. And something else I did, which I'm very proud of, is I went out doing a Meet the Members campaign. So I went around the country and I visited as many as possible of the SEPA members in their own offices, wherever they were, small and big, in-house and private sector. And it was exhausting, but it was really good fun. People were so welcoming, and I learned such a lot about what they value about their SEPA membership and what SEPA needs to do better at. And I think that was a really important piece of work. And yeah, I'm proud I got through that.
Hearing all that actually makes me think that really there is something of a legacy as well, because I think the role has changed. You know, what I now see of the way the role is done is more in line with what you've just described and maybe what went before. And also that business about collaboration. SEPA is now very collaborative with other organisations. I sit on the committee of the Intellectual Property Lawyers Association, with the sort of IP solicitors group, and there is a lot of interaction between us and SEPA and SITMA and all the others, and especially over the last few years. You can imagine how valuable that has been. So, you know, you can look back with a bit of pride maybe on changing of direction in a way that has proved to be very helpful in very difficult time. Anyway, we're getting to the nub of it now. 2015, a busy year for you. You were president of SEPA, but also around that time, you were helping to set up IP Inclusive. So let's start, if I may, with an outline of what IP Inclusive does. I think there'll be listeners who are not really aware of what it is. So this is your chance. What exactly is IP Inclusive?
It's an initiative that's devoted to improving equality, diversity and inclusion, and increasingly mental well-being in the patent profession, not the intellectual property professions. So throughout the IP sector in the UK. IP Inclusive isn't a thing as such, it's just a sort of a banner under which lots of well-meaning volunteers get together and work together for that common cause. And it's been great at bringing people together. There's some really important points about IP Inclusive. One is that it is pan-professional, so it is for all of the IP professions, not just patent and trademark attorneys, which is my background, but anyone who works in or with intellectual property. But the other thing is, you know, the corollary to that is it is sector specific, so it's very much tailored for the IP professions. So it's a group of people who understand one another. They're united not by the job they do, but by the people they do it for. So they understand one another's client bases, they understand one another's motivations and constraints. So IP Inclusive brings those people together and says, okay, what can we do as a group that will really benefit equality and diversity and inclusion in this space, and that we know will work for the people in that space.
So what was the driver? What, you know, something must have triggered you to go down this path. What was the driver behind your idea for this organization? But what were you seeing, or maybe not seeing, that led you to think this was a necessary step?
Well, in some ways it follows on from our previous discussion, because other people drove this, in the sense that I just convened a meeting when I was at SEPA to bring all the different IP sector organisations together to talk about diversity. So this was, you know, the start of this collaborative process. And I thought, well, I'll see what happens. And in fact, it seemed to touch a nerve, because everyone that came, and lots of people came, were all very keen to progress the matter. And those people, in a sense, drove it from then on. But I think what had initially informed me was I think you're right, it's the things we weren't seeing that were the most important. So we weren't seeing a lot of non-white faces at IP sector events. We weren't seeing women on speaker panels and in the boardroom. We weren't seeing disabled people on the platform. And I think importantly, we weren't seeing a recognition that that was an issue. So we had a lot of people in the profession who were very comfortable in their roles, and, you know, I don't want to stereotype, but a lot of them were white middle-class males, but, you know, people who were actually in relatively privileged positions, who were saying, well, what exactly is the problem? You know, if we don't have diversity, it's not our fault, because we recruit on merit. And if we don't get the right recruits, then, you know, that's not our fault. And we don't mind recruiting good women when they turn up, and good black people when they turn up, you know, and we'll treat them equally. So what is all the fuss about? And I think it was very difficult for, say, a white man at that time to know how it did feel to be the only woman in a room full of patent attorneys, or the only black person in a room full of patent attorneys. And, you know, unless you've actually experienced being part of an underrepresented group, you don't necessarily know how hard it is. So I think the key thing about what was wrong at that stage was that people weren't necessarily recognizing that diversity and inclusion were issues.
Yeah, I mean, it screams out at you when you think about it, doesn't it? Because you're just turning your back on a huge talent pool. I heard it said around that kind of time that in the IP profession as well, in the professions generally, the search for trainees, the search for entrance into the profession ended up with partners looking for basically people who looked like their own children. Yeah. And that they weren't prepared to countenance the idea that there was something else out there. And of course, everyone claims that they're merit driven, but of course, how do you define merit? And you know, that
is the key issue. Yeah, a meritocracy it may be, but what criteria are you using to judge merit? And inevitably, people were looking in the mirror and saying, well, there's a good patent attorney, so that's what the next one must look like.
Exactly.
I think people have got a lot more objective now. Which
the sheer, the sort of fascinating dynamic created by diversity is just being missed out on, isn't it? So, so one of my previous guests in this series was Scott Roberts, president of IP Federation. Now, he's a huge supporter of IP Inclusive, as you know, and carries its message to the in-house world of IP. Do you have similar champions in the solicitors and patent attorney worlds and at the bar?
I've got loads. I'm so lucky, yes. And I don't want to start, you know, naming them individually, because we'd never stop. But I think what's been lovely is that, you know, the IP sector organisations like the IP Federation, where Scott is president, they tend to have a rolling series of presidents selected from a volunteer pool, and, you know, they change quite often. So what's really important is that we have support from the organisation itself, and that continues as presidents come and go. And we've been very lucky at IP Inclusive. We've had that from the key IP sector organisations. So there were the 4 founding organisations, CIPA, SITMAR, FICP UK and IP Federation. And they've been absolutely brilliant. They've supported from day one. But we've now got much more support from your own organisation, the IPLA, from the IP Bar Association, from many, many more. And perhaps most important of all, I think, from the Intellectual Property Office itself.
Right.
They have been extremely supportive, recognising, I think, that what we do to improve diversity and inclusion in the IP professions has a knock-on effect to the UK's IP system as a whole and to the customers that use it. So it's very much in their interest that this work carries on. And they've supported us right from the start, and that's lent extra credibility, I think, to our messages. These people, all of them, you know, say too many to mention, they've not just answered our requests for help. You know, they've actually volunteered help, come up with ideas, put loads of energy and enthusiasm and time into it. And they've gone out and advocated for us elsewhere. You know, that sort of active champion role, and that's helped us widen our reach. That's great.
Yeah, that's so important, isn't it? What could you point to maybe that you're particularly proud of in IP Inclusive's achievements so far? I mean, is there anything that you would say, I'm absolutely thrilled we did that?
I'm pleased we've got our outreach initiative, Careers in Ideas, which is doing a lot of work to raise awareness of IP careers upstream, so in the schools and the universities, because only if you have more people aware that we're here, will you get a wider range of recruits coming in through the door. So I'm very, very proud of that. But I think personally, it's the networking and support communities that we've set up, which have been really thrilling to watch. We have IP and Me for BAME professionals. We have IP Out for the LGBT plus community. We've got IP Ability for disabled people and carers. We've Women in IP, and we've IP Futures for early career IP professionals. And all of those were set up by people in those groups, just coming to me and saying, we'll set this up, we'll do it, we'll run with it. And they did. And it's just been brilliant the way those communities have grown, because they've become a safe space for lots of people who didn't previously speak out, but were looking for that safe haven, looking for a focus. So that the first Women in IP event they held, it was literally standing room only. You know, we had to draft in extra chairs at the back of the room. The first IP Out event for the LGBT plus community was just amazing. It was incredibly colourful, lots of Prosecco, everybody having a fantastic time. I've spoken to lots of people since who've said that before those groups were set up, they didn't really feel they had anywhere to go, and now they do. And that's been such an important part of making the IP sector more inclusive, of starting conversations that people previously didn't have, raising awareness about things. And the other thing I'm proud of, it on a more general level, is several people have independently come up to me and said that they think of IP Inclusive now as part of the furniture in the IP landscape.
Yeah.
And they can't imagine an IP sector without IP Inclusive. So
I was going to say just that. I mean, you're on standing agendas now, you know, so you're an agenda item on you know, key organization meetings. You know, everyone knows about it, everyone takes it seriously, and the benefits for the profession will be seen in the years to come. So, I mean, what more do you want to achieve, you know, while you're still there at the organization?
I think it's been very ad hoc, IP Inclusive, so far. It's been sort of like it's the Parent Teachers Association. It's just lots of individuals doing great stuff, but with no resources. And there's just me at the top pretending to run the show and getting increasingly bogged down. So what we need to do is get ourselves on a better structural footing, a more sustainable footing for the future. Get in a proper source of funding so that we know we can keep going, and we know we can bring in some extra admin support, because there's an awful lot of work needs doing now on communications and events organising and just general things like that. Yeah. So that's one thing we need to see happening, and we want to see that in order to, I think, provide more support for our charter signatories. I'd like to provide a lot more resources for them in terms of templates and off-the-shelf training that they can use at various points in an IP professional's career. So I'd like to see a lot more support there. I'd like to see a lot more work done on the awareness raising upstream. I think there's still an awful lot we can do to not just make more students aware of IP, but actually help them access IP careers, particularly if they come from the less privileged backgrounds. So there is a lot more work to do. But the main thing is, just to hold on to its key values, which are primarily, inclusivity. IP Inclusive is something that anyone can get involved with if they work in IP, and it has to stay that way. It really does.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think, the professions are all geared up to recruit at university level, but when I was in charge of our training recruitment program many, many years ago now, I took it down to the schools, and we actually had school children come in. So before they made their university choices, and I was trying to interest them in the law and aspects of the law at that stage. And I think, you kind of almost have to do that, because they're kind of committed by the time they choose a degree. I mean, I know you can always go back and requalify, but particularly for the patent attorney profession, you really do need to have done a science degree. So, you know, you've got to be encouraging that right down at that level, haven't you?
You do. Yeah, I mean, you think of my own career choices. I could so
Yeah.
easily have gone the language route at A-level because I didn't know that my ideal career was waiting for me down the road, but needed a STEM degree.
Exactly.
So we are trying to do a lot of work in schools. We're working with the community interest company National Careers Week, which does a lot of careers advising in schools. We also work closely with the IPO, who have their Cracking Ideas campaign to raise awareness generally of IP amongst school children.
Yeah, that's excellent. So what are the biggest obstacles then facing your objectives? Are there any things that you'd like to push out of the way, or that could be fixed with a bit of a push from all sides?
Well, I think right now, as I was saying earlier, it's just time, time and the money to buy that time, because we've got lots of willing volunteers, very enthusiastic, lots of ideas, but they've got day jobs as well, all these people.
Yeah.
So they need a bit of backup that's there at the IP inclusive end with the administration, with the communications, the organisation. So what we really lack at the moment is just the money to be able to buy in a little bit of extra help, I think.
You want to create a small secretariat, don't you, really?
I think we do. I think we've grown big enough that unless we have that, we won't be able to continue on the current trajectory, which everybody tells us they've got confidence in.
Yeah.
But, but we need to deliver on that.
Well, I hope people listening to this, maybe one or two people might put their hands in their pockets. You never know. Go on, listen.
I hope so.
Know what to do.
Yeah.
On that subject of who listens to this, the audience for these podcasts appears to be international in scope. So do you think there's any scope for the internationalization of IP Inclusive's activities? I mean, there might be someone listening out there who is interested in doing something in their own country. Would you have a message for them?
It's interesting you should say that, because in the last year I've had a lot of contact from IP professionals outside the UK, either saying, can we get involved in IP Inclusive directly, or can we set up something similar in our country? Now, because we're so short of resources, we have had to limit what we do here to UK-based IP professionals. So we're not trying to go any broader than that. But what I do say to these people is, well, find out what you can about IP Inclusive, and by all means try and roll out a similar model in your country, and we'll help you where we can. There doesn't seem to be anything equivalent elsewhere, particularly not one that's sort of very much focused on IP specifically. So what we're hoping to do later...
You can think of a number of countries where that could be helpful, though. So we just need some passionate supporters to get a hold of it in those places. So. Yeah,
and I think it would be more of a challenge in those countries. But later in the year, we're going to hold an event where we invite all these professionals from other countries to hear a bit more about what IP Inclusive does, and maybe join some breakout sessions to talk through the ideas about what they might take back to their own countries, what would work and what wouldn't. And I'm sure we can learn stuff from them as well. So
I'll certainly look forward to that.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah. So what's your overall message then to the IP community? What would you like the IP professions to do now actively to help IP Inclusive in the pursuit of the Charter goals?
Raise awareness. Just make sure that all your colleagues, all your staff know about IP Inclusive and make the most of it and get involved where they can. Yes, hands in pockets is going to become important in the next 12 months. So have a look at your corporate priorities and see if there's room in the budget for supporting a good cause like this. But I think the main message is, hang on in there, let's hold on to this. We've done such a lot, and we've all done it together. And it has these unique qualities because it's pan-professional, but specific to IP. There's an awful lot going for this movement. So let's make the most of that. Let's build on it together.
So what about you? You've faced a lot of challenges, on a personal and professional level over the years. What goals do you personally have now after you've had a successful and wide-ranging career so far? Do you look out into the future and think, oh yes, there's things I still want to do?
I think we've established, Gordon, that my career so far has been, just a series of lucky opportunities, and I've made the most of them. But I've never planned ahead career-wise. And a bit of an admission here, really. But I've never thought of myself as having a career that I want to plan. The career has more been a sort of a vehicle to allow me to do the job that I enjoy, which is possibly not the right way around, but it's enabled me to look at each individual opportunity in terms of, would this be good fun? What could I learn from this? And then take it regardless, because I don't have any set plans, is the honest answer. Certainly not now as I get old and grey. But, you know, the great thing about being old and grey is if you had imposter syndrome, it starts to wear off a bit, because the higher up you go, the more you realise that there are lots of other people who don't deserve to be there either. And so, you know, I'm at least as good as them. I understand my strengths and my weaknesses now, and I can work to those. But I think I've sort of earned my place now. So whatever I do next, hopefully I'll do it with a bit of confidence. And hopefully that will centre around in continuing the fight for diversity and inclusion.
That's terrific. It's funny you say that. I remember my father came out of the army after the war and didn't go into university or anything. He just went into industry, and he said his whole career was spent looking upwards at the board and going, I want to be there, I want to be there. And then he got there and he looked around him and thought, what a bunch of idiots.
Yes. Well, I wouldn't go quite that far, because obviously for obvious reasons it might be slanderous. But there is that element of it. You are in awe of the people at the top. You think you couldn't possibly be one of their number. And then when you get there, for whatever reason, you realise it's just a bunch of ordinary people just like you, and they're all doing their best to, you know, greater or lesser effect. They're all still, well, most of them are still learning. I'm still learning, and I hope I do carry on questioning my ability to do what I'm doing and my worth, because that's what makes you improve.
Well, that's the way you stretch yourself, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look, many thanks, Andrea. Can I just say how much I personally support the work of IP Inclusive, and will continue to support it and try to encourage it through my own firm and through IPLA as well.
Thank you.
There has always been a tendency for law firms, patent attorneys alike, to use a very old-fashioned recruitment process that does produce sort of clones, if you like. So until that cycle is properly broken, the profession will be missing out on a lot of great talent. So keep up the great work. And I hope some of our listeners will be prompted to offer some, how can I put it, material support to you. But thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you for your time and your insights today.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been great fun.
I will be back soon with another subject. But in the meantime, thanks to our listeners for your very kind attention. And I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation. Thank you all. And thank you again, Andrea.
Goodbye.